Writing a Life by Joel Rogosin, read by Seth Honig. For my mother and father, Deborah, Melissa, Robin, and Susan. Mensches, Mavens, and Mentors. A kind of introduction. I remember early, first grade mornings, standing all bundled up in snowy lines, watching my breath puffs, waiting for the school bell to ring, and planting seeds in Dixie cups on windowsills when spring came. Between the 5th and 10th grades, I had 3 distinct boyhood crushes. I dropped out, I went to boarding school, I dropped back in, and Richard Brady tried to kick the crap out of me. It might have been because of Audrey Charlesworth, but who can tell after so long? I did like her, and once I gave her a phony silver bracelet I'd sent away for with a Bon Ami coupon from a magazine ad. I was teased mercilessly about that, and I tried to deny it, but it was no use. Apparently, everyone in school had seen the advertisement. In no time at all, Audrey removed the offensive object from her graceful wrist and once more bestowed her favors elsewhere. Somewhere in the midst of junior high, or middle school, was the dark, beauteous, unobtainable, I was skinny with thick glasses and a wandering left eye, Anita Robinson, and winsome Zelda Wildman, who I did go out with, once. But more of that later. On one occasion, I remember the teacher encouraging everyone to perform for the class. I stood there in front of the blackboard, boldly singing what might have been Sweet Rosie O'Grady from a contemporary movie, The Dolly Sisters, 1945, with Betty Grable, John Prine, and June Haver. I would have even hazarded a soft shoe routine if I'd known how. That's how misguidingly confident and enterprising I was. Perhaps because Anita or Zelda were there. Again, I can't be sure, but I know I would have sung and danced my heart out for either one of them. When my teacher asked me to sing a version of the 23rd Psalm at assembly, prompted, no doubt, by my exemplary classroom performance, I wrote out the words on 3x5 cards. They were blue, I remember, but from the first I was uneasy about the whole undertaking. And, as it turned out, with good reason. I got off to a pretty fair start. The Lord is my shepherd. No want shall I know. He leadeth my path where the still waters flow. Then I dropped the cards. While the teacher vamped at the piano, I scrambled to pick them up. But I couldn't get them back in order. And for all I know, everyone is still staring at me, and I'm still standing there, dying of embarrassment. One of the reasons I remember the 5th grade is that we moved from Arlington, Mass. To Arlington, Virginia, when I was in the middle of that year. My dad had just left private law practice in Boston for a position as an administrative law judge with the National Labor Relations Board in Washington. He'd always referred to it as the board, as if it were a person. The board wants me to hear this and such a case. One of his most important early assignments involved the West Coast Longshoremen's Union and its, some might say, notorious leader, Harry Bridges. If I'd been in high school, or even junior high, I don't think my parents would have interrupted a school year. But in the 5th grade, who cares? They must have been right, because I don't remember anything about the 5th grade in Massachusetts, except the name Lock School. Only the latter part of it I spent in Virginia at Patrick Henry Grammar School. Clearly we had crossed the Mason-Dixon line. Another thing I remember is how my father showed up one day in the early afternoon, standing in the doorway of my classroom in his top coat. The teacher went to him, and they talked for a moment, and then she motioned me to join him. My father took my hand and led me outside, and we walked along with him, holding my hand, and I saw him crying softly. I had no idea what was going on, and I was upset to see my father crying like that. Finally, I asked what was wrong, and he said, Abby died. He pronounced it Abby, and I didn't know whom he was talking about. I thought he might mean his cousin Henry, who was sometimes called Saxy, because he used to play the saxophone, and who I'd heard referred to as Abby once or twice because Henry was his middle name, and Abraham his first. I was wrong. It was my father's older brother Abe who had died, unexpectedly of a heart attack at 42. It was a very sad time, and I know my father never got over it. Abe's children, Terry and Hank, they were Esther Maxine and Henry David when they were young, are 2 close cousins, and we love them dearly. My father always felt obliged to be a surrogate for his brother Abe, and I'm sure he wanted to do more for them than he could. Somewhere, we have pictures of my uncle, looking fit and athletic. In one, he's gripping a lamppost halfway up, with one foot touching and the other arm and leg outstretched. An impressive feat of strength and agility, I thought. As a kid, I was very proud of him in that picture. Hank and Terry each married terrific people. Hank's wife, Leslie, is warm, earthy, and energetic. Terry's husband, Duke, a trade show producer, is steady, dependable, and affectionate. We stayed at each of their homes on occasion and had fun together. And once, when they stopped at our house in Woodland Hills on the way to Hawaii, Terry and Duke took our dirty laundry on their vacation with them by mistake. Are you still with me? The other thing I recall about the 5th grade was my teacher, Miss Weeks. She was, beyond all reason, my first mentor. I'm not sure why. Once, long after Deb and I were married, when our kids were small, I was cleaning out the garage yet one more time, and I came across a report card from the 5th grade. Miss Weeks' handwriting on the back was faded, but still legible. She had written firmly, "Joel is disruptive in class." And I was. Disruptive, loud, and clever, or so I thought. Attempting to compensate, no doubt, for my skinniness, my wandering left eye, and thick glasses. I guess my appearance gave Richard Brady the idea that he could kick the crap out of me with impunity, but he was dead wrong. I remember asking someone to hold my glasses. Maybe it was Audrey Charlesworth, while Richard and I wrestled in the hallway outside the classroom. I know I was kicking the crap out of him when somebody, maybe it was Miss Weeks, broke us apart and reprimanded us soundly. Regardless, Miss Weeks recommended me as a school patrol, and for the rest of the year, I wore a white canvas belt and shoulder strap with a silvery badge and stopped traffic while schoolmates crossed the street. It was a big deal then, much more important than being an adult crossing guard today, which is laudable, but which has no cachet. It's funny which teachers we remember and which ones are long forgotten. My 1st grade teacher was Miss Johnson, and in the 2nd grade I had a teacher whose unfortunate name was Miss Hoare. I recall her not because of her name, because in the 2nd grade, who knows from hookers, but because she was very annoyed with me when I refused to write the capital letter G in the particular configuration of the Palmer method. I was convinced it should look just like a small g, only bigger, demonstrating logic beyond my years, but she never bought it. Somewhat later, I had a writing assignment which produced, "The teapot bubbled on the stove like a fat man doing a tap dance." My teacher said one of my parents must have composed it. She and Miss Hoare, I'm sure, were responsible for my later writing with an absence of simile and a minimum of G's. On the corner, a few doors down from us, when I attended Thomas Jefferson Junior High, in a house that looked like ours but was a single family instead of a duplex, lived Captain and Mrs. Harris Matline. I always called him Captain. He was in the Navy. Most of our neighbors were either in the military or with the government, and he had a badminton court on his front lawn, which was much bigger than our postage stamp patch and actually green. I was still skinny and nearsighted, and I was not athletic, except for catch and 2 hands below the belt touch football. But somehow I could play badminton. The Harrises were childless and friendly, and when he was home, Captain Harris used to come over and ask my mother if I could come out and play. Once he took me along when he visited a friend's small farm, and he showed me how to pump water from a well, which was a revelation. One of the kids on the block was shy, awkward, Steve Halprin. 20 years later, I caught up with him at Universal, where we recognized each other across a table in the studio commissary. Now he was tall, good-looking, and poised. I think he was a production assistant at the time. He had become a producer, and later an insurance executive. What a coincidence, after 20 years and 3,000 miles. When I was away at boarding school in Tucson later, roly-poly lookalikes Mr. and Mrs. Breslau and my teachers, Gentleman Cowboy C.P. Wynn, Lanky Mel Moore, and Tiny Miss Himmy, and Mr. Brandis, who ran the place, all seemed to take a special interest in me and encouraged me. So did Bob Harris. The name is one of many coincidences in my life, or were they? Who owned the nearby stable and rode with us twice a week. I guess in Tucson, I was only marginally disruptive. When I left for home after 14 months, Bob gave me a business card. On the back of it, he'd scrawled, Joel Rogosin. I spelled my name for him. Can ride anything that's been broke. I cherished that card for years. My father visited me once in Tucson, and I persuaded him to go riding with me so I could show off my newly acquired horsemanship. He was miserable, on an old, semi-retired steed named Sir Harry. Assigned to all beginning riders, I recalled our ride was short-lived, and my father struggled to remain upright in the saddle and maintain his dignity. He was miserable on an old, semi-retired steed named Sir Henry, assigned to all beginning riders. I recall our ride was short-lived. When I was producing The Virginian, we filmed locations at the old Iverson and Albertson ranches, on either side of the 101 freeway near Agora Hills, California. That's been Westlake Village for some time now, since they dredged out a big chunk of it for upscale houses, shopping centers, and the picturesque lake. I'd get there early in the morning with the crew, and stamping at the cold, we'd wait in line for the scrumptious bacon and egg sandwiches the caterer fried up in his truck. Then one of the wranglers would nod to a spare horse, and I'd ride out alone through the fragrant, shimmering fog, enjoying the solitude and thinking of Bob Harris and the special, privately owned, not stable horses he'd let me ride when he knew that I could, and about the time when he gave me his business card. One weekend, I went riding with my actor buddies, Herb Edelman and Louise Sorrell. Like at Tenderfoot, Bob Harris's patience would have been sorely challenged. I galloped downhill to the barn, and the horse threw me. I was dragged quite far before I let go of the reins, and later at home I struggled into bed, virtually paralyzed from the waist down. The next day, when the stiffness allowed me to move a little, I drove to the hospital in considerable discomfort. The doctors in the emergency room were pretty impressed with my embarrassing purple condition, a massive hematoma from the proverbial guggle to the zatch, and they called everyone in to look. Attendants, other doctors, staff people, nurses, even, to my further annoyance, a couple of patients, gathered around me, the men pointing and smirking, the young nurses giggling. I thought the nurses were the most obnoxious. At Falls Church High School, my fastidious English teacher, Mrs. Miles, rumpled Mr. Michu, history, socky Mr. Barrett, chemistry, and bird-like Miss Hurt, drama, were extraordinarily kind to me. Earlier, at Washington Lee High, Shirley MacLaine and her brother Warren Beatty were there, but I didn't know them. I sang in the school choir, which had an excellent reputation, traveled occasionally, and won many regional competitions. Florence Booker, Miss B, was the wonderfully warm and attentive choir director. Everyone adored her. On her recommendation, I was elected treasurer, and later vice president of the choir, and one summer she sponsored me for a scholarship to music camp. She also encouraged me to try out for the Madrigals, the choir's prestigious small group. She gave me acceptance and approval, and wrote in my yearbook, "Love to a sophomore who has won the respect of everyone." She made me feel important. When we went back to Virginia for my 25th high school reunion, Deborah located Miss Booker, long since retired from me. On the phone, she said she remembered me, and I had a chance, at last, to thank her. Recordings were made of our Christmas concerts. I think they cost $10. I wanted one badly, but never asked my folks for the money. I'm still trying to track down one of those old records. Another high school teacher, Bill Snodgrass, took me under his wing and challenged me, intellectually and spiritually. He also wrote a warm message in my yearbook, almost a full page, and gave me cufflinks when I graduated. The imposing Senor Maggie Pinto, who taught freshman Spanish at Stanford and threw erasers at us when we made a mistake at the blackboard. He made us work on the blackboard like grammar school kids, I think to mellow us. Leaving white splotches all over most of the class was a memorable influence. And steely-eyed Marjorie Bailey, premier teacher of Shakespeare, finally gave me a coveted A in her class. I remember her crisp manner, her efficient bun-in-the-back hairstyle, and sensible black shoes. In the theater and drama department, sedate Dr. Norman Philbrick was a mentor and sent us a wedding present. Soft-spoken Professor Wendell Cole, who designed and directed The Climate of Eden, invited me to be his assistant director, even though I was always late to his 8 a.m. introduction to film class. On at least one occasion, he locked me out. At adjacent urinals in the men's room later, I explained, truthfully, that a progression of elephants, trunk to tail, unloaded from a circus train, had impeded my progress to class, and I believe that caused the meticulous Professor Cole, startled by my latest revelation, to nearly wet himself. Youthful Bob Loper saved my ass when his boss, the pompous head of the department with whom I'd had a run-in, wanted to throw me out of school. Rumpled, lively F. Charles Strickland validated me, gave me the choice of directing an original little theater production or having my own first play produced, and invited me to live with his family for part of the school year, a singular honor, which I reluctantly declined. I thought living there would interfere with my progress as I courted Deborah. It was a talented classmate, Doug Cook, who ultimately moved in with the Stricklands. Strick gave his students advice about acting and directing professionally, which I've never forgotten. If you can see yourself doing something else, he'd say, do it. If you can let yourself be discouraged, you didn't want it badly enough. The rumor was that he refused tenure at Stanford because at the time he was still unpublished. So much for inspired teaching. Years later, my brother Roy told me that he'd met Strick's widow when she attended a production at Roy's Theater in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He'd said she'd recognized the name Rogosin. I doubt if she'd remembered me after so long a time, but it made me think again about the Mobius strip that life becomes. At Stanford, an artist in residence and the English actor, Patrick Wymark, taught us Elizabethan dances. I acted with him in Mary of Scotland, playing Lord Burleigh, and Miriam Seldes, whose father Gilbert wrote at least one of our textbooks, played Iphigenia in Taurus, and showed us what acting was all about. During my junior year, I worked part-time with Bleached Like Lucy, fun-loving Ethel Tripaldi, and John and Audrey Garmovich's local drugstore. Ethel and her adoring husband Lou had no children. They had plenty of room, and they needed someone to look after their dogs when they took time off. So I moved in with them for a short while after my folks moved to Beverly Hills, abandoning me in my sophomore college year, and we had a ball. Lou was a butcher, and the first time he asked me what I'd like for dinner, I said steak smothered in lamb chops, and that's what we had. Once, when Ethel was trying out a new recipe using a pressure cooker, it exploded all over the kitchen, and we laughed till we cried as we cleaned up the mess. We invited the Tripedis to our wedding, but regrettably they never replied. Perhaps they were annoyed with me for moving out just after they bought a new house with a room they said was for me. Richard Learman was one of my good friends in college. So was David Penhallow, whose family had a street named for them in Portsmouth near Roy's Theater. Although they're from Hawaii, one-time seafarers, I guess. What a surprise it was when I spotted it. We were also close to Judy Dottie, who played leading roles in college productions and was a bridesmaid at our wedding. Later, she worked in Hollywood as an actress and a drama coach. Al Gibson was my best man and became Melissa's godfather. Richard and David were my ushers. That sounds so formal. We had a small wedding in a converted Quonset hut before Rabbi Rosen got his beautiful temple built in Burlingame. Al went through Stanford on a scholarship from the Walnut Creek Mothers Club. He was apparently the only applicant. He lived with a maiden aunt and her companion in the hills above the campus, and drove around in an old hearse with big yellow dogs slumbering inside. Richard's parents, Frank and Esther, befriended us after we got married during my last year in college, and when Melissa was born in San Francisco later, we drove down to Palo Alto and stayed at the Learmans on New Year's Eve. It was our first daughter's first slumber party. She was a month old. Frank Learman was an engineer who'd been able to retire at 52. He was a role model and a benefactor. He gave me some valuable pointers on what to do with my life, challenging me with questions, and he loaned us the down payment for our first house in L.A., $1,750. It simply didn't occur to me to ask my folks. I knew Frank had it. We saved up so we could pay him back within 6 months, and sent him a case of scotch when he refused to accept interest. For a while after Richard moved to L.A., we saw a good deal of him, but unfortunately, as time passed, we lost touch. Alice Middlecoff, Gabrielle James, was another pal and became a successful script supervisor on Cheers and Frasier. In my professional life, socialite Martha Bigelow Elliott, her husband ran American President Lines, hired me fresh out of college to act in her theater company, Alice too, the San Francisco Players Guild, and made me the assistant managing director. If Deborah and I had stayed in the Bay Area, she was going to turn the company over to me. In L.A., kind and gentle Jean Arnstein, a friend and colleague of my father's, got me started as an assistant theater manager when I was desperate for a job. Enigmatic development executive Jack Manuel pulled me out of the story department at Warner Brothers and made me his assistant at NBC. But first, he mistook me for another story analyst, John Tate, whom he hired and fired at the same time. Ubiquitous and generous Howie Horitz and his wife Harriet befriended us, became Susan's godparents, and Howie made me a producer at Warner Brothers. Senior VP Jennings Lang protected my tenure at Universal when my job was threatened and supported my career in other subtle ways. And dynamic talent executive Monique James was an ally. I think Catherine Ross, Butch Cassidy, was one of her claims to fame, and Carrie Snodgrass, Diary of a Mad Housewife. When she left Universal, Monique managed Sharon Gless, Cagney and Lacey, for a time. Deborah's always said that the reason I'm self-centered is that my mother loved me too much. Maybe she's right. Maybe my mother loved me enough to give me confidence when I needed it, and a sense of humor to bolster my confidence when it faltered. Maybe I did feel important sometimes, and special sometimes, because my mother loved me. Or maybe there were just certain people who recognized in me something salvageable, or who saw through my bluff and bluster to something inside that needed support and guidance. I guess Deborah must have sensed something, because thank God, she married me.